In 2015, a Victoria Cross, Britain's highest medal for valour, was found in the mud on the banks of the River Thames in London. And on the reverse was a date, 5th of November, 1854. It had been awarded to a participant at the Battle of Inkerman during the Crimean War. In a 7-hour battle fought in dense fog, 8,000 British soldiers held off an attack by nearly 40,000 Russians. In the confusion of the fog, the battle broke down into individual, almost company-size encounters, where individual soldiers' discipline, professionalism and courage, rather than generals conducting the overall movements, were key to whether you lived or died. Because of that, the Battle of Inkerman has often been called the Soldiers' Battle. 20 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions of valour conducted that morning. The youngest recipient was just 19. And at the end of that 7-hour battle, over 2,000 British were either dead or wounded, while their Russian opponents had lost 12,000 men. But apart from a few road names, Inkerman seems to almost have vanished from British history. So what really happened at the battle? And who did that missing Victoria Cross belong to? Just to put the battle into some sort of context for you, the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856 was fought between the French, the Ottomans and the British, and then the Sardinians, and on one side, and the Russian Empire on the other. Basically, it was the British and French were concerned at Russian territorial ambitions in the Balkans and the Black Sea area, mainly at the Ottomans' expense. On the 14th of September 1854, the Allies landed a sizable army on the Crimean Peninsula, which was then part of Tsarist Russia, and laid siege to the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. Just over a month later, on the 25th of October, the Russians had unsuccessfully tried to seize the British supply port at Balaclava. The ensuing Battle of Balaclava witnessed 3 courageous actions by the British: the stand of the 93rd Regiment, immortalised as the Thin Red Line, the charge of the Heavy Brigade, and the famous charge of the Light Brigade. In fact, I've made a video all about the Battle of Balaclava. There's a link appearing, about now, and I'll also put one up at the end of this video for you. On the 5th of November, the Allies, principally the British, faced another major Russian attack, but this time it was on an altogether much bigger scale. The battle was fought to the north of that recent Battle of Balaclava, on the right-hand section of the Allied line besieging Sevastopol. And once again, it was in the British sector, this time near the village of Inkerman. The Russians under General Dannenberg were determined to break the siege, and his proposal was to attack the British positions in a 2-pronged attack. General Soimonov would advance east out of the besieged Sevastopol with the Russian 10th Division, a force of about 20,000 men, whilst General Pulov would attack from the northeast, having crossed the river at Inkerman. And once united, the 2 Russian wings would come under Dannenberg's personal command as he lifted the siege. The British 2nd Division would bear the brunt of this pincer movement. They were stationed on a ridge of high ground called Home Ridge, on a road that led down to the crossing point at that village, over the river at that village of Inkerman. The British had actually created a barricade across that road, which was called Quarry Road, and which they referred to as the Barrier. Just to the north of Home Ridge, they had positioned troops on a smaller rise, which was called Fore Ridge. And indeed just to the east of Fore Ridge was an empty battery emplacement, which went by the name of Sandbag Battery. And you're probably wondering why I'm going through all these names, but they become really important in the fast-moving battle that we're about to witness. This would be the route of General Pulov's advance. To the west of the 2nd Division's camp was a narrow valley, along which the Sevastopol garrison under Soimonov would attack. Behind the British 2nd Division were the camps of the Guards Brigade and the Light Division, both of whom were to play crucial roles in the coming Battle of Inkerman. As dawn broke on Sunday the 25th of November, 1854, the church bells in Sevastopol started to ring. The clanging sound of those Russian Orthodox bells was not a call to worship, but an encouragement to the 20,000 troops who even now were silently advancing towards the British positions. That day a thick blanket of fog had descended on the hills and valleys to the east of the Russian naval base, obscuring their advance from the British. Soimonov placed his 20-pounder guns on a high ground called Shell Hill, overlooking the British positions. or at least it would be overlooking them when the swirling fog finally cleared. At the same time, General Pulov was marshalling his troops to cross the river at Inkerman. In total, General Dannenberg had 42,000 men plus 134 guns to smash through the British positions, manned by 8,000 men. And through the fog, the Russian army advanced. Their force coming out of Sevastopol was funnelled down a deep ravine with their artillery up on Shell Hill to their left. The first the British knew of the attack was down in the ravine when their forward pickets saw the grey masses of the Russian army appearing out of the mist in front of them. They opened fire, alerting the British commander, General Pennefather, to the danger. With over 30 years from combat experience in India, Pennefather was an aggressive soldier who believed the best form of defence was attack, even if you couldn't see your enemy. Without hesitation, he ordered all 2,700 men of the 2nd Division to advance into the fog towards the invisible enemy. With the element of surprise now ruined, the Russian artillery on Shell Hill opened up on the 2nd Division camp on Home Ridge. In a devastating bombardment, the camp was destroyed. But by then, the 2nd Division were no longer there. Somewhere in the fog, they were advancing on the Russian infantry. The same fog that prevented the Russian artillery from seeing the fruitlessness of their bombardment also prevented senior officers on both sides from taking strategic views of the ensuing battle. The Battle of Inkerman descended into vicious, localised fighting where junior and non-commissioned officers played as much of a leadership role as the senior officers present. And because of this, the Battle of Inkerman is often referred to as the Soldiers' Battle. As 6,000 Russian troops advanced up that ravine, they found themselves in a bottleneck where they couldn't make their superior numbers count. They couldn't spread out either side. Finally, they made contact with the very far left-hand end of the British line, held by the 49th Regiment of Foot. The British defenders fired a volley, then they fixed their bayonets, and at 40 yards they charged into the advancing Russians. In brutal fighting, the Russians were driven back down the ravine, but not before the commanding officer of the 49th, Colonel Dalton, had been killed. Now General Soimonov arrived to personally lead the second attack up the slopes towards the British lines. The fog was so thick that the Russian general was unable to actually see his enemy, nor could he see how dispersed they actually were, having advanced off the crest of the escarpment. Had he been able to do so, he might have called up his reserve and broken through the British left wing. As it was, he advanced with what he had, only to run straight into the Light Division, coming up under General Sir George Buller, who had arrived from their camp to assist in the defence. The 77th, later the Middlesex, and the 88th, the Connaught Rangers, clashed with the Russians. Initially, the Russians' advance pushed them back over the ridge of the escarpment, capturing 3 British guns in the process. But then, through the mist of the battle, the 47th, the Loyal Regiment, hit them in their flank. The rest of the Light Division turned to face the Russians, and it was the Russians who were forced into a retreat, losing those 3 captured guns in the process. In the fog, the fighting was a scene of complete confusion and of close quarters, bloody bayonet fighting. And through the smoke and fog, even though they couldn't see him, his soldiers could hear Brigadier Pennefather cursing and shouting encouragements. General Buller was wounded in the left arm, whilst General Soimonov was killed by a lowly British infantryman. Command of the Russian attack now fell to a colonel, but within minutes he'd been killed. Another colonel took charge, only to fall again within minutes. Shocked, confused, leaderless, the Russians started to fall back down the ravine. It was about now that the rest of the Russian 10th Division from Sevastopol swung round to their left to attack the barrier on Quarry Road, which was defended by those pickets who had engaged the initial Russian advance earlier, and the 30th Regiment, the East Lanks. Once more, despite their numerical superiority, the Russians were driven back. That Russian army out of Sevastopol lost so many men, in particular so many officers, that many units failed to take any further part in the battle. But the Battle of Inkerman was far from over. It was now that General Pulov, having crossed the river, attacked the British positions on Home and Four Ridges with his 15,000 men. For the rest of that morning, the focus of the battle would be on the barrier, on Sandbag Battery and the crests of Home Ridge and Four Ridge. As the Russian masses stormed uphill to the barrier, 300 men of the British 30th Regiment, led by Lieutenant Mark Walker, leapt over the barricade and charged them with their bayonets. Stunned by the ferocity of the attack, the Russians fell back. Walker was to be awarded the Victoria Cross for that action. Later in the Crimean War, he would lose his right arm, and ultimately in his career he'd rise to the rank of general before dying in 1902. Meanwhile, on the far right of the British line at Sandbag Battery, the men of the 41st, the Welsh Regiment under Brigadier Adams, took on 5 battalions of Russian infantry on their own. Forming into an extended order line, they carried out yet another bayonet charge, which pushed the Russians back towards the river itself where they'd crossed earlier that morning. And whilst all this fighting was raging in the swirling fog, General Dannenberg finally committed his 9,000 reserves to attack Home Ridge. The Russians now exploited the fact that the 41st had advanced down the hill to storm Sandbag Battery, which was now being defended by just about 700 men. Finally, it was looking like the vast Russian steamroller would flatten the British position. Despite the ceremonial roles they fulfil, the Guards regiments are some of the oldest fighting regiments in the British Army. The Coldstream Guards are the oldest continuously serving regiment in the British Army itself, having been established during Oliver Cromwell's time. The Grenadier Guards were established just a few years later to protect the exiled Prince Charles, soon to be Charles II. And the Scots Fusilier Guards, who are now the Scots Guards, had taken up defensive positions in London against Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite rebellion in 1745, and later had fought at the Battle of Waterloo. Now these 3 regiments arrived at the Battle of Inkerman. Their 1,300 men providing welcome relief to the 700 defenders at Sandbag Battery, and just in time too, as a force of nearly 7,000 Russians were advancing up the hill in the fog. The battle at Sandbag Battery shifted backwards and forwards as both armies fought, more like a medieval battle than a modern warfare, with bayonets and even bare fists being used. At one stage, a detachment of Russians actually managed to take over the Sandbag Battery position. Major Russell of the Grenadier Guards asked for volunteers to join him dislodging those Russians. Sergeants Norman and Privates Palmer and Bailey stepped forward. Together, the 4 men stormed the Russian position. Bailey was killed in the process, and Private Palmer shot a Russian who was about to bayonet Major Russell. For that action, Private Anthony Palmer, the 35-year-old from Sandbach in Cheshire, was awarded the Victoria Cross. Later that morning, he also led a desperate charge, which successfully prevented the Russians capturing the regimental colour. Finally, the 4th Division under General Cathcart arrived. As Cathcart met Pennefather, he asked where he was needed. "Everywhere," was the gruff response. A man who seemed to take his orders and requests quite literally sometimes, Cathcart started to distribute his men quite liberally until he only had about 400 left under his direct command. It was at this moment that General Airey rode up with orders, so he purported, from the Commander-in-Chief himself, Lord Raglan, to support the Guards and not to move off the ridge. Cathcart moved forward to Sandbag Battery where the Guards were, and then ordered a charge straight past the Guards, down the slopes towards the Russians. In the mayhem, he now found himself cut off and came under fire from Russians who were stuck between his force and the Guards up on the ridge. Cathcart believed that this was a friendly fire incident from the Guards, and he ordered his men to throw off their grey overcoats so that the Guards regiment would recognise them as British soldiers. Well, this only made them more obvious targets now for the Russians who were surrounding them. And as Cathcart now, somewhat belatedly, tried to lead his men back to safety of the ridge, he was killed. The Russians were still pushing forward, and some units were now starting to take over parts of the crest, were starting to cut it up onto the crest of the ridge. With the battle still hanging in the balance, the British now received valuable reinforcements in the form of their French allies. Having marched 5 miles from their camp, the French attacked the Russian flank, knocking them sideways and sending them back down the hill. Around the same time, the British finally manhandled 2 large 18-pounder guns onto Home Ridge, where they now started to fire at the Russian guns on Shell Hill and put them out of action. The Battle of Inkerman did not end with a final charge or a heroic stand. It simply petered out at around 1 p.m. Both sides were absolutely exhausted from nearly 7 hours of almost continuous hand-to-hand fighting in the smoke and the fog. Heaps of bodies covered the ground, especially around Sandbag Battery and the barrier. British casualties were about 2,300 out of a force of 8,500, about 27% casualty rate. The Guards Brigade alone suffered 600 casualties out of their 1,300 men. Even the French, during their brief participation, had lost nearly 900 men killed and wounded in the final stages of the battle. The Russian bill, however, was colossal. 12,000 dead, wounded or captured from a force of 42,000. 10 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest medal for valour, were awarded to members of 10 regiments, plus the Naval Brigade and the Royal Marines. Of those 20 VCs, only 2 cannot be accounted for. Those awarded to Privates John McDermott and John Byrne. Byrne, aged 22 at the time of Inkerman, was from the 68th Regiment of Foot, later the Durham Light Infantry. He went back to rescue a former comrade during one of those seesaw advances and retreats between the British and Russian soldiers. John McDermott of the 47th, later the Lancashire Regiment, was on Home Ridge when his commanding officer was unhorsed and injured, and under fire and fending off Russian bayonets, he rescued his commanding officer. McDermott eventually became a Chelsea pensioner. Byrne died in 1879 in South Wales. During a heated argument, he shot a colleague, and then he turned the gun on himself. To this day, neither of those heroes' Victoria Crosses has been found and accounted for. The Battle of Inkerman was a victory for the Allies, in particular the British, but it fundamentally hadn't changed anything in the Crimean War. The siege of Sevastopol would last another 11 months. But after this defeat at Inkerman, the Russians never again tried to break the siege with a direct attack on the British lines. In the meantime, the British would have to face the bitter Russian winter, and it was the weather and the administrative inadequacies of the British Army that would test the brave Victorian soldiers' capabilities to their very limit. The Battle of Inkerman was a battle that the generals could not control, because they couldn't actually see what was going on. In the swirling fog of a November morning in 1854 in the Crimean Peninsula, British Victorian soldiers, in particular their junior officers and NCOs, displayed a level of discipline and courage and dogged determination that has become the hallmark of the British Army to this day. The Battle of Inkerman, 5th of November 1854, the Soldiers' Battle. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. The Crimean War has some incredible stories, and I think I should tell some more. Maybe the Battle of Alma, or the story of Florence Nightingale and the nurses who went out to the Crimea. What do you think? Drop me a line below. Tell me. I'm working hard on more stories from British military history for you, like the Indian Mutiny, more from the Boer War, the story of Colour Sergeant Bourne. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. Keep well, and I'll see you very soon.